Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining me today. So I get to play host today on the show. Obviously, the focus today, I'm talking about industrial control systems. That tends to be the thing I like most. So I'll get into those today on the show with the 5 critical controls. It's a paper Tim Conway and I published over the SANS Institute. I'll drop that link in the chat as well. But I really wanted to be able to explain it and also engage with you all. So I'm already seeing all the good mornings from Houston and everything else. And yeah, absolutely morning to y'all as well. It's fun when this can be interactive. Webcasts are always interesting, but a lot of times you're talking to a large audience without a whole lot of feedback. This I prefer because it's a lot of engagement. So y'all are the ones that are going to make the show. So engage with me, ask questions. I'm here for you for that purpose. So again, just a highlight of what we're running through the show. I'm going to end up talking to you about some of the cool SANS things coming up, like the SANS ICS Summit. And I'll give you some insight into some new things we're doing this year there. The majority of it, I'll be talking about the SANS ICS 5 critical controls that Tim and I wrote. And then we'll have a section, probably about 11 minutes long or so, of news bites, which is the SANS sort of news letter, if you will, that takes all the latest insights, all the latest news stories, synthesizes them down, and shares some quick analysis. We have our guests, Michelle and Thomas, that are going to be going through that. And so we'll let them brief you all on that before I get into the main portion of the talk. So I'll start the show off outside of, again, just saying thanks. Oh, from Nigeria as well. A lot of good places on Nashville, Nigeria, Bangalore, man. Again, UAE. Some of y'all are staying up for this, so I appreciate it. This is cool. Anyways, I'll get through all the cool stuff in the talk, but let me go ahead and highlight kind of the advert piece, if you will, of the SANS Summit, and then I'll end up transitioning over to our guests. But every year, Tim Conway and I co-host the SANS ICS Summit. So if you're interested in industrial control systems and learning about sort of the classes we have and things like that, that summit is the best place to be. There's probably 3 or 4 really good conferences for ICS security in the community. I'm always happy to go through them and answer questions on them. But the SANS ICS one is my favorite, not just because I get to co-host it, but because it's educational driven and it's the larger portion of the asset owner and operator community. So like most of the attendees are actually working in the field. They are engaging and working on the topic. So it's very hands-on practitioner-led content. It's not like, here's a risk framework that no one's ever used. It's, if there's going to be a risk discussion, it's here's a way to put this in action, and here's how we actually did it, or here's the latest malware vulnerabilities that we saw. It's a very practitioner-led conference. A wonderful event to go to, and we put a lot of effort and work in the SANS ICS Summit to just really make it complete for folks. So number one, it's going to be back at Disney's Contemporary Resort. So we'll be back at Disney World in Orlando, Florida. I love the venue. Tim and I and the whole SANS team have fought for years to get back to Disney. We got back to Disney last year, and we're going to keep going at Disney from here on out. So what you'll see is that in that link there for you if you're interested, and I'll also drop in chat. We will be back at Disney World. Now, the thing to be aware of with the Disney World venue is the Contemporary is normally very expensive. I mean, you're talking oftentimes anywhere from $800 to like $1,000 a night to stay at the Contemporary. Because of the room rates, because of how we've done it, the hotel fees end up usually getting down to like $300 or $400 instead. So it's still an expensive hotel, but it's a lot less expensive than it normally is. Here's the trick that most people don't take advantage of that I would, that I do. Tim and I always do this. Come before or stay after the summit and the classes. They'll actually extend your room rate for like another week or so. So the summit itself is like $400, $425, I think. Yeah, I'm looking at it now, $425. It's free when you take a class, but if you're just coming to the summit, it's $425, and you're saving a couple $100 a night when you want to stay at Disney World. So you should come for the summit. You should come for the actual content. But if you also are just looking for a family vacation at Disney World or something, it's the cheapest way to do it. It pays for itself in that way. So it's a good trick to take advantage of. We'll have all the normal kind of awesome courses, ICS 456, 610, or excuse me, 612, 515, all the good courses, right? 410 will be there. But we also have Security 504 as well. So there'll be a number of classes that run after the summit. So if I just give you highlights here, make sure to come. It's in Disney World. The summit itself is the 17th and 18th of June, but the courses will run from the 19th to the 24th. Now, the other thing to highlight is there will be a day 0, and that's on June 16th. So if you want to come early on June 16th. We'll have a Father's Day barbecue. We'll have like a hands-on, like capture the flag kind of hacking kind of, defensive competition. And Tim Conway, Jeff, and I wrote a new course that's going to be launching next year called ICS 310. And ICS 310 is just a day-long introduction into industrial control systems. And we've worked with SANS to make it by far the most affordable class. Like like the price is still getting set, but you're talking like hundreds of dollars, not thousands, for a SANS course, which is really cool. But just as a, kind of trying to get people in the community. But on day 0, so coming on June 16th, it's going to be free and included with like the summit. So long story short, you can come a day early and take an introduction to ICS and ICS security with Jeff, Tim, and I on June 16th. There's the June 17th and 18th summit itself, and then 19th to 24th of the courses. So check it out, and we'll have a lot of fun together. So that's my advert, if you will, but it's something I'm pretty passionate about and excited about. So we'll then transition to our guests, and we'll get going with material. So over to y'all.
Hello, and welcome to Wait Just an Infosec News Bites. I'm contributing editor Michelle Peterson here with my editorial colleague Thomas Wolf, and we've got another great show for you today. Thomas, why don't you give us a rundown?
Thanks, Michelle. Today we have an update about the MOVEit file transfer software vulnerability, and we have news about a Zimbra zero-day patch. And in our last piece, we're going to cover the new SEC cybersecurity regulation that just passed.
Thanks, Thomas. I'll get things started for us. The MOVEit file transfer software vulnerability saga continues to unfold, with news now of more than 500 organizations being affected. One of the most recent victims is the U.S. government services contractor Maximus. 8 to 11 million people are going to be getting notice that their social security numbers, personal health information, and other personally identifiable information was compromised. Maximus is estimating the cost of addressing the breach could reach $15 million. Accounting company Deloitte has refuted claims that it has been affected by the MOVEit attack after it was listed on the threat actor's website. Now, the Russian ransomware group Clop has claimed responsibility for compromising the MOVEit vulnerability. Newsbites has been covering the story closely. You can check out past coverage of the story by going to sans.org/newsbites. Now over to you, Thomas.
2 weeks after its disclosure of a zero-day vulnerability being actively exploited in Zimbra Collaboration Suite email servers, Zimbra released security updates to patch. The cross-site scripting attack allows threat actors to steal information and execute malicious code on compromised systems. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency has given federal agencies 3 weeks to patch the vulnerable ZCS email servers on their networks. CISA is also strongly encouraging private businesses to patch for these vulnerabilities. This follows an incident Newsbites covered in April about an XSS bug in the Zimbra-hosted webmail portal that compromised the emails of European government, military, and diplomatic organizations involved in the Russia-Ukraine war. Michelle?
Thanks, Thomas. In regulatory news, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission issued a final rule requiring publicly traded companies to report material cyber incidents within 4 days, with exceptions for incidents that may pose a national security threat. This new regulation also requires publicly traded companies disclose their cybersecurity expertise by describing the board of directors' oversight and management's assessment and management of cybersecurity risk. And for more context and insight, SANS' Director of Emerging Security Trends, John Pescatori.
Welcome, everybody. Here in the U.S. recently, the Security and Exchange Commission announced some rulemaking of some topics it's been looking at related to cybersecurity for quite a while now, for close to a year. SANS was involved with them back last year in providing community input. For those of you in the international audience, the Security Exchange Commission sets the rules and regulations that publicly traded companies on the U.S. stock markets have to obey in their financial reporting. And their usual goal is to make sure there's transparency so that a potential investor can make an informed decision about the risk of a certain company, whether it be financial risk or global conditions risk or political risk, or in this case, cybersecurity risk. And the SEC over the years has sort of ramped up requirements around cybersecurity reporting for publicly traded firms. Now, there's a lot of publicly traded firms. There's way more ones that aren't publicly traded, privately held companies. They tend to also be influenced by what the SEC puts out, because auditors tend to look for what the SEC is asking for, even when they're auditing privately held companies. But these rules and regulations will only apply to your company if you are working for a privately held company, a publicly held company. Now, what the announcement was here recently, and then we'll drill down a bit into the meaning of it, was really two things. One was that publicly traded companies will have to disclose cybersecurity incidents that have material impact within 4 days, 4 calendar days, so 4 times 24 hours, of making the decision that the incident had material impact. So let's drill down on that one first. So obviously the important thing is, well, what does it mean? What's an incident of material impact? If we had a virus that wiped out 200 people's desktops, it cost us some money. Is that of material impact? The answer is probably not. Typically, the SEC and other financial authorities have defined material impact as something that changes a company's financial projections or causes some measurable financial hit that drops its profit a significant amount. And the percentages aren't really engraven in stone. But if somebody said, we anticipate for calendar year 2023 that we will have $1 billion of profit, and this one cybersecurity incident is now going to reduce that billion down to $500 million, that would be material, a 50% drop in revenue, in income. But if it was a $100 billion company that said, well, our revenue was going to be $100 billion, now our revenue is only going to be $99.5 billion, that $500 million drop in revenue may not be financially material because it's such a large company. Its revenues are so big. So there's limited reasons why you'd have to report within 4 days, but that will become the new standard, that you have to justify why you did not report an incident within 4 days. So that's a little faster, had been really not totally defined, but 2 to 3 business weeks was typically seemed okay. When this kicks in, obviously things will have to move faster. And again, it is after your company has determined that the incident's material. So that doesn't mean that your time to detect, time to respond, time to restore, time to report all has to squeeze in within 4 days, unless you have a really quick financial side of your company calling out, oh, this is material, bing, start the clock. But it does put pressure on rapid and accurate reporting of incidents. The second thing they put out was, one thing they'd asked for SANS input on last year was they were thinking of requiring publicly traded companies to disclose who on their board of directors was responsible for the oversight of cybersecurity and what their qualifications were for doing so. So the identifying who it is isn't that hard. Most publicly traded companies today already have designated somebody, typically on the risk committee or on the audit committee, somebody as the lead director responsible for oversight of cybersecurity. But the issue of why are they qualified to do that was an interesting one. So obviously, since SANS is in the business of educating people and maintaining certifications, we think that's key to anybody demonstrating expertise. But that's typically not simple enough. They can't simply say has education and certification, because then people could send in cereal box tops and get some weird certification on cybersecurity and say, yeah, I've got mine from Kellogg's. And that's probably not very meaningful. So they decided to punt on trying to make that be something that had to be reported, because they could not come up with a way they felt was acceptable of essentially defining what expertise was. So what they changed it to be is companies have to publish their risk management processes, which organizations and which people, which positions in their company are involved in determining and investigating cybersecurity risk, and what are the risk management capabilities of the people doing that. So it's not just who's on the board of directors, it's across the company. It doesn't even have to be just the board of directors or just the CISO. Could be, well, we're a software company, so risk is important within software development. What are the capabilities within this software development organization for determining risk of avoiding a material impact? So that's something that puts a lot of interesting pressure on making sure cybersecurity awareness, education, and deeper hands-on education is pushed across the organization, not just in the security group or just not very high-level training for the boards of directors or the CFO or the management team. So that's something that will be kicking off here within 30 days of the announcement. And for the big major financial reports, for the year-end type financial reports, will have to show up in 2023, this calendar year's reports, and then for other incident type things later in the year. So from a perspective of what does it mean to you and what the importance of this is to your company, I think it is important to say we definitely need to continue our efforts in education and training, but not just in the security staff. To think about what are some of the other key positions. For example, a lot of focus everywhere on supply chain security because the bad guys have been going after our supply chain partners as ways to get into us. If we've gotten too hard to hit, they look at our supply chain and they're finding great success in getting in. Think of the Move It vulnerabilities that are out there now or the many previous ones. So within procurement, within the procurement organization, or within any part that's making supply chain decisions, the business units may have to be educated because they're part of risk management and risk assessment as well. So it's a broad mandate, leadership type training, developer type training, because software plays such a key role in risk and vulnerability. And then obviously training in the Security Operations Center and staff are key to being able to demonstrate compliance with these regulations. Now, these are not setting standards for it, but you will have to disclose your levels of awareness and education and expertise across those different positions. And then if there is an incident, then that can be used against you. If you did not live up to what you say and your company is saying you have that expertise, but you really don't, or if you didn't develop to an extent necessary to protect things, then your company will be liable. So it's a good thing to educate the chief legal counsel about. So in summary, we're all big adherents for education and awareness being sort of key to that holy trinity of people, process, and technology. It's the skilled, educated people that can put in place the killer processes, the effective and efficient processes to keep up with the bad guys and select the right technology for security controls to make it doable and help us win this war against the attackers. And the education of the people is going to be something publicly traded companies are going to have to demonstrate here from 2023 onward. So that's it from my side. I'm John Pescatore with SANS.
And those are your SANS News Bites for the week. For more critical cybersecurity news and commentary from some of the sharpest minds in InfoSec, don't forget to subscribe to the SANS News Bites newsletter, your twice-weekly summary and analysis of the most significant cybersecurity developments at sans.org/newsbites. Thanks again. I'm your host, Thomas Wolf.
And I'm your host, Michelle Peterson.
We hope to see you again next week.
All right, so let's go. Hopefully that was informative to folks, but we're going to get on to the main portion of the presentation today, which is going to be a conversation with you all about the 5 critical controls. So I'm going to outline them and go through kind of what we were trying to do and how to use them. And then hopefully we'll get a bunch of questions. So go ahead and start racking in your questions, especially if you've already read the paper or just have general questions about ICS security too, for all that matters. Feel free to go ahead and start asking and we can start lining those up. But 5 critical controls. So how did this come about? Why did we do it? There's a lot of standards and things out in the community already. What was our intent? Cool. So Tim and I, for years, have been at SANS. I've been there about a decade now. So I'm a fellow in the ICS curriculum, wrote the ICS 515 kind of network monitoring and incident response for industrial control system class. And then I wrote the Forensics 578 cyber threat intelligence class in the DFIR curriculum. But anyways, from the industrial control system side of the house, there's constant questions we would get from students over the years. And I would see these same questions out in my day job at Dragos and seeing these same kind of conversations happen with clients and so forth. And at the core of it, it really came down to we haven't necessarily done a lot in OT before, most companies. We've either done the regulatory side if we are regulated, or we've done like maybe a segmentation project or put in the firewalls and kind of maybe put in some switching and things like that. But we haven't really done all of the investment that we think we should be doing relative now to the fact that the environments have changed and become largely more digital, more connected, and we're seeing adversaries targeting and disrupting these environments. Where do we get started? What do we do? And a lot of the standards and frameworks are really, really good, right? NERC SIP on the regulation side for bulk electric systems in the US, 62443 for a kind of a global standard that's used pretty heavily too in manufacturing and oil and gas, NIST cybersecurity frameworks. Like these things exist, but they can be daunting when you look at them. And some people, in my opinion, use them inappropriately, where instead of saying, what should we do? And let's map it to the framework to have a common language, a lexicon, they instead treat it like a bingo card. Well, I got to do this. 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 And then there's no real strategy behind it. It's just kind of going down a checklist of like controls that you may be able to do. And it may not be the biggest risk reduction to your environment. And more importantly, depending on your environments, like you could be gold plating the problem, spending way too much money, because not all assets are created the same. It's not like there's one IT network, it's a bunch of OT networks. And so that OT or operations technology side of the house, you might have 1,000 plants, you might have 1,000 substations. Heck, even if you have 5, what are the priorities? Anyways, so taking this backdrop of people wanted to know where to get started and wanted to understand what are the critical controls. And we got asked for years about the critical controls, because SANS developed years ago the top 20 critical controls, and that was for IT, right? So that those 20 critical controls were pretty popular in the community, pretty widely used. And so all the time we get hit up with, cool, what are the critical controls for ICS? And so Tim and I started this years ago and sat down originally with trying to map the 20 critical controls over, and it just didn't work. Also, a lot of the 20 critical controls are preventative focused. It's not really getting a lot into detection, response, recovery, which are very, very core for everybody, but especially in industrial operations. The ability to get like root cause analysis when something goes wrong, whether it's adversarial related or not, is core to being able to actually operate your facilities. So what Tim and I did is we sat down and said, cool, let's take all of the incidents that we're aware of, public and non-public, like all the threats, all the attacks that have taken place on industrial control systems. And let's apply a very basic filter of what are the controls that were effective in all of these attacks? Like what were security controls that would have been good investments for everything? And I wanted to keep us out of, well, this could have been useful in this way, or this could have been useful, because eventually you're going to get 30, 40, 50 items. I was like, no, let's not go down the path of what could have been. What was really useful? Like what's the top control that would have been useful in that incident? Okay, what are the top couple? Like what are consistently good investments? That way it's not, hey, this is a good security control against this edge case threat. That might not be a good investment for your company. It wouldn't be a critical control. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but it might not be the best investment. But if it's one of, this is consistently useful in all the different incidents, well, not only is that a good control, that's something you really should be doing. That is something that's, again, consistently good. So that's the filter we applied. What is consistently useful in all of these attacks, and what would have been good controls to have in all of these attacks? And that sort of formed these 5 controls. Originally, I just wanted 4, kind of the Australian ASD did like their 4 years ago. And I like just keeping it simple, like 3 or 4 is good. We made it into 5, but it's a heck of a lot better than like the 20 and everything else that can follow. And so I was really excited that we got it down to the 5 that made sense. And one of the major insights I've had dealing with incident response cases and similar, and just being a part of a lot of these major attacks, from everything from Colonial Pipeline to Ukraine to whatever else, was the necessity of it being a strategy. So we need it to be together. It can't just be checklist box, going down the line. That's how we get problems with compliance. It's got to come together to be a strategy. And I wanted it to be focused on threats. And to do that, I wanted to start with incident response. And so that's the first critical control, is ICS specific incident response. Now there's a lot to go into this, so I'll explain, but why was that so important in the beginning? In my observation with the instance I've worked, almost always there is a disconnect between the executive staff and board and the practitioners on what the ground truth reality is with what can be done in the incident, or how prepared you were for it in the first place. Additionally, in IT security, there is a lot of native logging and native data for a systems and data world. Okay, so IT is very systems and data. If Microsoft rolls out a vulnerability on accident that allows remote code execution and privilege escalation on a new, fully patched Windows box, that's a bad day for everybody, and everybody's feeling it. So that system focus means that there's a lot of security controls focused on that system. endpoint protection system. You're looking at patch management in a very, very serious way because it's to focus on the system. You are taking a lot of access controls and similar on that system, password changes and so forth on that system. And also data, systems and data. I'm generalizing a lot, but generally speaking, IT security, system and data. And on the data side, PII, credit cards, things of importance. You're going to have encryption at rest, encryption in transit, data loss, prevention technologies and tools, monitoring for that data, classification markers, etc. Systems and data. In OT, it's systems of systems and physics. I don't really care what happens to an engineering workstation. Adversary jumps onto an engineering workstation. It's not a great day, but if they jump on an exploit and there's a vulnerability on it, whatever, okay, not necessarily bad. But an adversary getting on an engineering workstation with or without vulnerabilities and malware, but with the knowledge of how to use system one, the engineering workstation, to reprogram a logic controller and runtime operations, system two, in such a way that there's a physical manifestation in that plant, system three, that's dangerous. Systems of systems and physics. So, taking it back to the incident response piece, you absolutely should prepare for incident response anyways. But you can get through IT incident response cases without really preparing. And I know that sounds horrible, but you can't. There's enough data, there's enough tooling out there, et cetera, that let's say you have an incident in your IT environment, you didn't do much. You're going to call in a Unit 42, a Mandiant, a CrowdStrike, whatever, and they're going to come in and they're going to drop their tools on those systems, and it's going to be able to pull the data that's resident on that system. And of course, you would have wanted more, but you're going to be able to fumble through the investigation. Okay, you're going to be able to get through it because all that system and all that data kind of focus has surfaced up a lot of data to be pulled even after the attack. In a systems of systems world, and in a physics world, if you didn't collect the data before the attack and during the attack, it may not be present. In most cases, it won't be. If the adversary on the engineer workstation is sending network commands, let's say it's a Yokogawa system and they're sending VNet IP protocol commands to a Yokogawa controller to modify the logic, unless I've got backups already of that logic to do a diff between them, or unless I'm doing like network monitoring and understand the protocols to see what commands were sent, there's not a whole lot I can answer from that incident. It's transient data between a systems of systems that if it wasn't collected, there's nothing to collect after the fact. There'll be some logs, but not much. Not as much as you'd have in a systems world and a data world. So a lot of the ICS incident response cases I've taken, the big finding beyond the disconnect between board and executives and practitioners, the big finding is the questions that were going to need to be answered during and after the incident for regulatory, legal, for operations, for security, for business choices, all that are very rarely not obtainable. They're not answerable because people weren't collecting the right data before the incident. So let's say there's 20-ish questions that people want to ask during an incident response. If they're not prepared ahead of time, they're answering like 2 or 3 of them. And so a lot of ICS incident response turns into therapy and then a post-compromise hunt because you're really not doing the incident response because you don't have any of the data and there wasn't the tooling deployed ahead of time. And I can't just come in and drop things into those environments or drop a tech stack in as easily. So there's a lot of things that just cause it to be overly complex without preparation. So that first critical control, the ICS incident response, really sets the strategy for what are we doing. You're essentially reverse engineering out the incident. So you start off with what are our crown jewels? What are our plants and facilities and so forth that matter the most? Got it. And so you have that list. Maybe it's the top 25, 50% of your facilities. With that, what are the scenarios that we should be good with as a company? Now, I'm not talking about just like making up scenarios. One of the big disconnects between security practitioners and board members is a lot of security practitioners want to throw out, oh, I saw this research at DEF CON and you could take a Bluetooth on a wind turbine and spin it back. And the first question is, has it ever happened? And they go, no, but I'm not interested. And the security side of the house sometimes feels we're not being proactive. Actually, though, the role of the board, especially in invested companies and public companies and similar, It's very much around benchmarking. So what are we doing against peers? And it's about scenario planning. And you're not generally going to get scenario planning and benchmarking buy-in from a board on things that have never happened. So that's the first step. So that's setting the strategy essentially through having what are the scenarios that matter. And you should be industry specific. As an example, if I'm an electric power company, it is really important for me to understand ransomware and operations. It's important for me to understand Ukraine 2015 scenario, Ukraine 2016 scenario, and pipe dream. Those are 4 things that have happened in the electric industry that matter. Oil and gas, ransomware and operations, Trisis scenario, pipe dream. So you're going to find like 3 to 4 scenarios to get started with of things that have actually happened in your industry. And those are setting the groundwork of this is the thing that matters. This is the scenario. That scenario then is what we have to think about. Well, if that happened to us, what data would we need? How would we detect it? What would be taking place, et cetera, to be able to get the data that we need for the incident, to be able to detect the threats, to be able to do all these things. It's hyper important to use those scenarios to guide the conversation. Otherwise, you're going to get in debates on the team. Was this a good control or a bad control? That's an ethics discussion. None of the controls are good or morally bad. What they are is they're controls on, are they relevant to reduce the risk that we've all agreed on? That's the main thing. All right, one quick second. Somebody's beating at my door, of course, during a live broadcast, but one quick second. All right, so always real world these days, and because we're out of COVID for the most part, of course, people come over and deliver packages. Anyways, first thing, instant response, set the scenarios. That's going to help you actually understand what you need. It's going to lay the strategy for all the rest of it. And the benefit is it's now easy to communicate. Whether you're talking to your operations staff, your security staff, your board, anybody, it makes cybersecurity tangible now, because it's not simply something like, I want to make sure that I have a risk score or a FICO score or whatever. And it's like, what's the difference between 73 and 78? Like, cybersecurity tends to be really intangible because of the way we talk about it. But if I say to operations or a board or anybody else, here's a scenario that if actually happened, do we all agree that this is a real risk? Yes. Cool. Do we want to mitigate these risks? Yes. Cool. Well, based on how this attack actually took place across the full kill chain view, if you will, here is how we can do prevention, detection, response, and recovery. And as a result, this is the package that we're going to need to go deploy at these companies and so forth. And yeah, in case you're wondering, it's live. Yeah, obviously it's very live. But anyways, I love the comments on the side here. But essentially, what we get out of that is a way to communicate what we're doing in a way that everybody can understand, and it's tangible. Hey, if this scenario happens in our company, we're not saying we're perfect or good at everything, but we're saying we have the protections in place that we need and are considered best in class for the scenarios we actually are concerned with. And board and ops folks and similar, we're going to come back to you. Security is never finished. When there's new scenarios that are in our industry, we'll have a conversation if we accept the risk or not. And you'll find out that most of the security controls we put in place have value on other scenarios we haven't even identified yet. So you're showing yourself to be a good business leader. You're showing yourself to be able to be responsible with investments. You're able to show being able to mitigate risk that we don't even know about yet, or at least the starting of it. But you're also opening the door to, we will come back. And if we have other security controls in the future, it'll be based on us talking about this scenario and getting alignment on it. So now it's not us versus them or intangible or, the cybersecurity folks. Now it's a real conversation and done really well. All right, so ICS instant response. The second critical control is defensible architecture. And what is a defensible architecture? Well, the first thing is it has certain characteristics. One thing about a defensible architecture is I can put humans into the environment to defend it. There's no such thing as a secure product or secure architecture or secure whatever. It's defensible or indefensible. If it's defensible, I can put human defenders to go against the human adversaries in that environment. Maybe it's something as simple as having a span port on a switch that I can be able to access and do data, but defensible. So I needed to define what is a defensible architecture to me. Instead of just doing, taking 62443 or zones and conduits, whatever, I can instead look and say, what is the scenario? What would we need the architecture to support? What's the data collection or the collection management framework? Another paper I wrote, like what's the collection strategy of the data we need for the detection and response? What are some of the risks we can eliminate or reduce just by the architecture? If ransomware is one of our big scenarios in operations, a lot of the ransomware cases happen in OT from when an IT domain controller gets compromised and it pushes into the operations side of the house. A lot of times the OT, I mean, there are some targeted ones, but a lot of times the OT incident response cases we take, we're not targeted OT. It just spread through that combined and conjoined architecture, especially on things like domain controllers. So I might say, well, I want to separate out the domain controller. I want to have a unique domain controller for the operations side of the house because of this risk that we've identified in the scenario and all agreed on. That's going to be an aspect of our defensible architecture. So defensible architecture can mean a lot of things, and there's no like this is the cookie cutter, place to go apply it. It's, does this actually align to our scenarios? Is it make it where humans can defend in that environment while we mitigate some of the other risks? Then this is a good architecture. And again, it's not getting into the bingo game, and it's also not getting into the place where we're just throwing out all the possible security controls. And I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. Well, this is a risk and this is a risk. Well, how do we get through with man-in-the-middle attacks? And it's like, guys, stop. You're just going to end up pissing off all your operations staff. You're going to end up over spending against the risk, and everybody's going to have no idea what's going on. There's no alignment. It's going to cause friction. So by saying these are the characteristics that we need against the scenarios we have, that is why we're doing it. It aligns the conversation. It removes a lot of the debate, the friction, and the drama. So incident response, ICS incident response, where you're picking out your scenarios, you're actually thinking about what you need out of it, you're figuring out what you need out of the collection and so forth, moves into security control 2, your defensible architecture. Third is that ICS network visibility and monitoring. So that ability to have network appliances or data collection to be able to understand what's happening in that systems to systems world. What are the commands and protocols being passed back and forth? Understanding what's happening inside the ICS protocols, where the actual command data is, which is the whole point of those protocols. It's not the wrapper, it's the command data. So can I actually tell that somebody is turning a logic controller on and off? Can I tell that somebody uploaded new logic to a safety system? Can I tell that the switch key was moved from run to program mode? Like, can I tell what's going on in this environment? And the important thing about critical control 3 is, while we want to get into threat detection, the first use case of the ICS network visibility and monitoring critical control, that critical control 3, is the validation of that defensible architecture. We put this all in place. Is it actually what we expected? Is it maintaining? Is it maintaining over time? Now we're doing it through continuous monitoring. Did somebody throw up a rogue connection that we didn't know about and violated our defensible architecture? Did somebody modify all the firewall rules so that it's really just open, and any for everything? Like, what has changed in that environment? So incident response, critical control 2 is defensible architecture. The third critical control around network visibility monitoring is to reinforce that defensible architecture. That's the first use case. Then the second use case is to be able to do the detections to get us to the incident. It's no good having an incident response plan if you're not doing the threat detection, because you'll never see the incident. You'll never see the threats. So having that second use case of, cool, what are the threats that we care about? And in this case, we're not just doing like IOCs and things like that or indicators of compromise. You're looking for the tactics, techniques, and the procedures of the adversaries and of the threat scenarios you care about. So instead of sending every single alert to the SOC that they have to triage and drown in alerts, and now we're doing orchestration tools and everything to try to have less, you said, cool, we can go hunting in all of that extra stuff. But tier 1 analyst, out of the 81 tactics, techniques, and procedures in MITRE ATT&CK for ICS, these 22 are the most relevant to us based on the scenarios we've all aligned on. So we want you to be sure that you're focusing on that, usually through prioritization or making sure that there is SLAs on triaging those type of alerts. The rest of the stuff, go be proactive when you have resources and time. So don't kill yourself over it. Okay. So that now again aligns even the security operations side of the house to make sure that we can actually be aligned with that first critical control, and we're not drowning in all the data, especially data we may not understand yet, especially if we have new staff coming in that don't understand the operations environment. The fourth critical control is secure remote access. People want to jump to secure remote access or two-factor authentication all the time, but they don't even know what their inventory is. And time again, we see companies that have the nice two-factor, authentication, secure remote access projects and have them fully rolled out, but miss the unauthenticated VPNs and things that were still resident in the environment and didn't do a lot of good. So you're doing this in order: ICS incident response, defensible architecture, network visibility and monitoring. The fourth is the secure remote access. Now that we actually know what's important to us, we actually know what our environment looks like, we actually have a better architecture. Now's the time to go put that in place. And then the last one is a key vulnerability or risk-based vulnerability management. Now, that does not mean you're going to go through and patch everything. In most cases, you don't need to in operations. Most cases, you can make a firewall change or disable a port or service, and it fixes the issue better than the vulnerability patching. Vulnerability patching in ICS is very inconsistent, and it's, some of the vendors are better than others in terms of what they actually put in those. So at Dragos, we have this year in review report we put out every year, and we highlight the vulnerabilities as an example. We talk about the cases and threats and incidents, but we talk about the vulnerabilities as well. And every year that we put out that report, the vulnerabilities section has been eye-opening in the sense that around, I think, 38% of the time consistently, there are errors in the vulnerability reports. So you're using erroneous data to go deal with it. About 70% of the time, there's no mitigation advice other than patch it or don't. And all these vulnerabilities, like over 1,000 a year, many of them are useless in the context of operations. So what we do is we go through and look at and apply a simple filter: green, yellow, red, never, next, now. These vulnerabilities, these green ones, pose no risk. They're doing things that are already resident in the environment. Like, let's say I have a vulnerability that allows me to get the ability to upload logic to a controller from an engineering workstation in root permission. Well, that's already what happens on an engineering workstation. So that makes no sense to ever even use that vulnerability. The yellows are ones that are like, yeah, this introduces some new functionality, but it's not necessarily easy to exploit. Doesn't really have a huge operational impact, and we don't see anybody actually exploiting this anywhere. It's the next. So the greens are nevers. The next, the yellows are, yeah, get to this at some point. And then the reds are, somebody's either actively exploiting this or it introduces net new functionality that has real operational impact. And we look every year at these vulnerabilities, like I said, about 1,000 new ones each year. What we find is consistently about 60% is in that never category. About 30-something% is in the next category, of the next opportunity you should go take advantage of this. The now category consistently is about 2 to 4%. So I don't want to go into an operations site making a big heyday about vulnerabilities and what's our vulnerability patch ratios going up to the board or things like that. I want to be able to tell them, look, based on the strategy we're putting out and all the things that we're doing together, we're going to be able to identify these vulnerabilities on the inventory that you have, and we're going to keep like 96% of this crap off your plate. But when we come to you about the 2 to 4%, we're going to need your partnership because it's really that important. And now you've shown that you're not just coming in to do things in an operational environment just because you can, but you're taking a responsible approach and you're keeping a lot of the stuff off their plate because you're doing the hard work ahead of time. So ICS incident response, which is also really setting those scenarios and what do we actually care about, which is going to guide the strategy, down into control 2, which is defensible architecture, down into control 3, visibility and monitoring, down into control 4, secure remote access, down to control 5, key vulnerability management program, or essentially risk-based vulnerability management. That together sets a strategy and real controls that are based on real threats, and they're things you can easily communicate, and it also isn't gold plating the problem. So you now have the ability to go roll this out instead of a Gantt chart over 5 years with 30 controls that you'll never get to. If you do this approach, you will be in a very good place. I would call this like, this is the right approach for the threats and things that we're seeing out in the wild. Additionally, the things you're doing have operational impact and operational resilience impact beyond threats. As an example, the visibility and monitoring stuff. Root cause analysis is getting complex as automation environments become more and more automated and more digital. We have plenty of cases where operators are confused about what happened, even if it's not an adversary, and they don't know how to recover the plant correctly or safely because of this massive amount of sort of automation. Used to, if you went to the factory, the substation, the plant, whatever, somebody's, that engineer, her granddaddy worked at that plant, her daddy worked at that plant, she's worked at that plant for 30 years. Like, they know it. They've always known it. They've always known how to deal with their plant. But because of all the automation, because of all the digital transformation, whatever you want to call it, it takes now that person to know a subsystem, who then calls an integrator, who also has the OEM. Takes a team to even try to really figure out what the hell is going on. But as we're doing these security controls actually help with operational resilience use cases, secure remote access. I don't just have random contractors and integrators coming in and violating SLAs and making changes in the environment, security related or not. The network and visibility monitoring piece. I can actually see the systems of systems and know what commands were sent and make sure that my automation environment is online correctly, reinforce it, find out that the battery pack failed on the PLC and that's why we're having intermittent issues, or somebody got in an overhead ceiling and knocked off a GPS clock and that's why we're having a time shift across the energy management system. It's just good operational resilience to have these type of controls, and they have security benefit. Those are the ones that are going to be the easiest to get through in your organization, the ones that are easiest to get well funded, and the ones that have pound for pound shown the best return on investment against adversaries. So I am winding down here. Got a couple minutes left. I don't have a ton of questions. I see some questions, but if you have questions, this is the time and place. Let's see. How can we verify or validate the proof of concept of network visibility and monitoring solutions in ICS? Yeah. So again, I think the first thing is having like the use cases identified of what are we trying to do? So this is our architecture as an example, or high level, because you may not have it yet if you're buying a tool to do inventorying. So here's my architecture. Here's my scenarios from the incident response. Okay, here's the use cases I'm going to need to support. And if I care about, this scenario against threats for, let's say, oil and gas, okay, I need to know that you can detect the behaviors associated with a Trisis-like attack or the TTPs associated with that. We want to test that. Or because this is an oil and gas environment, here's my environment that I have and carbon crack or whatever else. Here's the architecture. Can you validate that the architecture that we have, can you find issues? Can you find problems in it? Can you continually monitor it and tell us what the architecture is so we can reinforce it? Key vulnerability management. All these solutions have vulnerability management. Cool. Are you actually helping me find vulnerabilities and give the guidance? Or are you just telling me, well, it's got a CVSS of 9.3, you should take care of it? That doesn't help us. Can I get into that like never next now and actually prioritize what are the key vulnerabilities? Because those are the ones we're going to focus on instead of, beating up everybody. So those are, I would define the use cases. I will tell you though, at this stage in the market and the companies you mentioned, like they're all good solutions. Obviously I'm biased because I work over Dragos, but like I'm not that biased because I'm a SANS instructor and I'll tell you firsthand, like they all have their flavors, but all the solutions are pretty mature. Usually beyond just the use cases these days, people are asking questions on, cool, are you going to stay in business? Show me your financials. Are you going to be a good partner for us? Can you go down that journey with us post install? Like what's the support and help that you're providing us after we buy the product? Like those are as important to look at as the technical use cases. Yep. All right, let's see. We've got some more questions coming in. Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks for the compliments. What would you say the distribution of the relative impact of threat intelligence is in the implementation of the 5 controls? Great. So threat intelligence to me is about knowledge, right? It's not like indicators. Indicators are the exhaust fumes of the intelligence process. Intelligence is really about having a requirement and being able to answer that requirement. It's knowledge. And that explicitly comes into play. I mean, it can be useful anywhere, but it really comes into play in Critical Control 1, ICS Incident Response, and Critical Control 3 of the ICS Network Visibility Monitoring. So I should be able to have the intel on what are the actual scenarios so I can do things like threat modeling for what I actually care about as an organization. That's essentially what is happening in that Critical Control 1. And I need to keep up with the latest understanding of the threats. The third one on visibility monitoring, I got to know the tactics and techniques of the adversaries. So that's intel there. And actually on 5 as well, because risk-based vulnerability management, I need to be able to say, you know what, these are the vulnerabilities that adversaries are actually exploiting because those are the ones we care about most. So that's, intel can be used in a lot of ways, but those 3 controls are probably the best place to be using intel on them. All right, so I'm getting told that I've got to start wrapping up. I'll take the last question. Would you place OT assessments under your Critical Control 1? Depends. It depends on what it is. If it's an assessment for like if it's like a tabletop exercise, that's under Critical Control 1. If it's like an assessment of the architecture and things like that, it'd be under Critical Control 2 of like understanding and reinforcing the architecture. If it's like a compromise assessment or a hunt, it's stuff that you'd be linking into Critical Control 3. Now, technically, assessments aren't a critical control, but you can use them to bolster those critical controls. Awesome. All right. Well, and the last thing I didn't mention is all those standards and frameworks, NIST, 62443, et cetera, they're all wonderful. This isn't to replace them. This is a strategy. And then you take this strategy and you map it to your standard and framework of here's the common language, here's the common lexicon. This is what we're going to do. Here is how we're doing it. Here's the language that's already been used in the community. This is what we're going to map to. So you're not replacing the standards. You're using this to drive the strategy and to understand what controls make sense for you and to pare it down to 5 critical controls. And then the actual implementation and things of that, go map what you've done into the standard to be able to communicate about it widely. So it's a way that it all actually really works together. Cool. All right. With that, I think we're on to the next section here. Let's see. Thomas, why don't you help me out? I think you were so kind to send me the notes, and I don't think I actually have it in front of my screen. I think I'm supposed to wrap up, kick it back to you, and we've got a couple things to end out the show, including some sort of say adverts, but they're really not, like talking about like new cloud security course, updates on Forensics 710, et cetera. So let me go over my people tab. Yep. So we're going to move over to the Cloud Security Exchange discussion with Megan. And thanks everybody for joining.
Hey everyone, it's Megan Roddy, one of the Cloud Forensics authors here at SANS. I'm super excited to be a part of the Cloud Security Exchange on August 18th. SANS is partnered with Google Cloud, Microsoft, AWS, so that we can bring you viewpoints, talks from some of the experts at the major 3 cloud providers. I myself will be a part of a talk and research discussing myths and missteps about cloud migrations, talking about whether the move to the cloud is right from you, should you divest from the cloud, and what can you do to prevent issues in the cloud that you may see if you don't plan accordingly. We've got great talks from all of our sponsors, different topics that are important to them, and we're even going to wrap it up with a panel where you get to hear from all 3 cloud providers, along with a SANS expert talking about everything cloud security. The event's free. There's no reason not to register. So make sure you get registered ASAP and join us August 18th for the Cloud Security Exchange.
Hi everyone, my name is Anuj Soni. I am a principal threat researcher at BlackBerry. I'm also a SANS certified instructor and co-author of the 4610 Reverse Engineering Malware course and the author of the relatively new 4710 Advanced Code Analysis course. Now, most people have heard of 610 and how it walks you through the essentials of performing static file analysis, behavioral analysis, and code analysis. But in these few minutes we have together, I want to introduce 4710, what it is, and why you or perhaps some of your colleagues might be interested in taking a look at it. Now, I'm sure you'll agree as time progresses, defenders and the technical defenses that they're implementing have certainly improved. And the result there is that attackers have had to get more creative and try harder to accomplish their goals on their target networks. The result of all of that is that malware has become more modular with more obfuscation and multiple stages of execution. And if you find malware in your environment, the ultimate goal generally is to understand what it's capable of doing to assess its risk to your network and to generate a set of rules in order to perform and protect yourself against this sort of attack in the future. This requires that analysts be prepared to dig deeper into malware and perform in-depth analysis, and that's really what 710 is all about.